So you start with 700 grams of water, which is the same as 700 mils of water. You really need a scale. And then get 200 grams of your leaven, which the leaven is basically just a small amount of your starter, like 50 to 80 grams, mixed with 200 grams of flour and 200 grams of water the night before, which is basically like giving your starter a really big feed. So you've got like a very kind of like a good chunk of your dough is really active and yeasty. And you mix that into the water and then add a kilo of flour. So the mixture here is 900 grams of all-purpose flour. You could use bread flour and 100 grams of whole wheat flour. You can play with changing that ratio. The important thing is the kilogram of flour. Because we've added 700 grams of water. Currently, this is a 70% hydration dough, but we're going to be adding another 50 grams of water later, so it'll end up being a 75% hydration dough. So at the moment, this is just really mixing it really thoroughly, making sure that there's no like dry flour left and all the water's sort of soaked in. I'm not trying to knead it. And then I'm going to set a 30-minute timer and leave it for the auto-lease, which is essentially letting the water soak into the flour. And in the meantime, we can measure out 20 grams of salt and 50 grams of water, which will be added after the auto-lease. So the auto-lease is done. We're going to add the salt. And then measure out the water, which I should have done before. And then just mix this really, really, really thoroughly. Because salt is a dry ingredient and it's not being mixed into the water initially, you really need to like mush it together to get that salt in everywhere. I'm not really kneading, but I am sort of starting to like fold it over a little bit as part of the combining. And then we set another 30-minute timer. Now when we come back, we'll do the first fold, the first turn. So when you come back, you get a wet hand, run your hand under the tap so that it doesn't stick to the dough, and then turn the dough, sort of folding 4 times, sort of the 4 corners of it. 4 folds is what's called a turn. So I just did 1 turn, and you probably want to do sort of 4 to 6 turns. It's a little bit hard to gauge exactly how many, but this sort of helps the gluten develop through the bulk fermentation. You can speed up the fermentation process by, like I'm leaving it on the bench here, and it's about low 20 to 21 degrees in the room, maybe 20 degrees. If you put it in a turned off oven with the oven light on, it'll warm up the ambient temperature, which will make the fermentation happen faster. But slow fermentation is also good. At the end of this, I'm going to put the dough in proofing baskets in the fridge overnight, which retards the fermentation, but lets it happen really slowly, and because it happens really slowly, it can really develop flavour. So I think I'm on about the 5th of 6 turns now. You can see it's a little bit hard to see in the video, but it starts to feel different. It's actually sort of feeling a little bit sort of tight there, but then this last turn it's now feeling like really sort of elasticy, and where the gluten feels like it's, to me at least, feels like it's really developed. So I stuffed up with the camera, and 30 minutes later I dumped the dough out onto the bench and divided it into two, and I dusted the proofing baskets with flour, and the video's working again. And this is just, these two dough balls have rested and relaxed on the bench. They were like very loosely shaped, which is why they relaxed so much, but now I'm going to actually shape them properly. So stretch it out horizontally and fold it over in thirds, then stretch it out vertically and tuck the top over. And then I don't do this very well, but I'm like basically like roll with my thumbs to like push the dough in and tuck it in to the inside of the dough ball, and then tuck it under to sort of form a ball. And now using the scraper, sort of like pull it towards yourself and let it get caught on the bench. So as you can't have too much flour here, you really need it to very, very lightly dust it so that the front edge gets caught, so that you're building up a very strong kind of skin on the outside. Skin's not the right word, but like you're building up tension on the outside surface, which helps it keep its shape as a dough ball. I'm perhaps being a little bit finicky here, but getting it into a perfect dough ball, and then really heavily flour it now. Now that we're not doing any more shaping, you can't go overboard with the flour. And then flip it over, and sort of, you can't really see a seam, but the seam is the bottom. So you put the seam side up, and then flour it again, and then we're doing the same shaping process for the second bit of dough. This recipe can absolutely be halved to just make one bit of bread, but flour's cheap and bread's easy to eat. So all of the work, it's almost no more work to do 2 loaves at a time as it is to do one. Beyond a little bit more time, obviously, baking. And at this point, where you're forming dough balls, you could cut it into 250 gram pieces of dough and use half of it for a pizza night and the other half for a loaf of bread. I would maybe change the flour slightly if we were making specifically for pizza, but you can use exactly the same dough for pizza if you want. That's great. So again, very, very, very heavily dusting it with flour. Up until now, before shaping, it's just a very light dusting, but once it's shaped and it's going into the proofing basket, you want to make sure it doesn't stick. So it's fine to use quite a lot. So that was 5 hours, like total bulk fermentation from the point that I mixed it in with the oven, and then I put it in the fridge in those proofing baskets overnight. So it had been 8 hours and 20 minutes in the fridge. You can see that it's sort of like a good test to see if your dough is proofed well enough. If you push your finger in and it sort of comes back slowly but not all the way, then it's probably ready to go. But I actually left these on the bench for about an hour and 20 minutes for the first loaf, and more like 2.5 hours for the second loaf. I think like letting it warm up for about an hour and 20 minutes was good for the first loaf, and probably a little bit too much. Probably got a little bit overproof to the second one, but it still came out fairly well, I think. And then this scoring of the bread is basically like as you get oven spring and the bread expands in the oven, it needs to expand somewhere. So if you put a big score on the top, like a quite deep score, then you can control where it expands rather than it just sort of bursting at the seams. I preheated the oven to 500 degrees Fahrenheit, and as soon as it goes in, you turn it down to 450 degrees. I set it at for roasting, which means the top element's on when I first put it in, but then as soon as I turn it down to 450, I turn it to bake, which means the top element's off and it's only the bottom element. You can see I used this is a combo cooker, but an enamel Dutch oven or a normal Dutch oven works just as well. And the point of that is that commercial bread ovens have steam injection, and normal home ovens are made to get rid of steam, and so the water in the dough, as it evaporates, it stays in the Dutch oven. So for the first 20 minutes you bake it with the lid on, and then you take it off for another 20 to 30 minutes to let it brown. So this is the second loaf here. Flip it out. I'm still not very good at flipping it out. Give it one deep score. You can do as many as you want. And you can experiment with different patterns and stuff. I've found that like one deep score is pretty good for getting it to rise up. And if you do your score on an angle, then you're going to get what's called an ear, where as it expands, the dough kind of like lifts up on an angle. 20 minutes later, take the lid off, push it back in, and then I think this was half an hour later that it was sort of like pretty much finished. This probably could have gone a little bit longer. You can really like flirt with how brown you get it to basically be burnt, almost burned on the outside. This is back to the first loaf. This is about an hour or so later. I went to cut it. It's usually best to leave it for a couple of hours before you eat it, but it's really hard to wait. The crumb is like okay. There's like, it got a lot of oven spring, so like it rose up, it rose to the correct size, but I feel like this is like too irregular. There's almost really tight areas of the crumb, and then like almost cavities, like it's too open. And that is it.